Hello fellow ARCs. Do you want to get good at line strike? Then you've clicked on the right video. I'm going to help you refine your strategies and build a really strong deck in order to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of the Type 2. First things first, you've got to build a strong deck. There are several kinds of decks you can play. Either mono element, dual element, or a mix of all kinds of elements. Element salad. Each element has their strengths and weaknesses. Identifying them will lead you to victory. Fire decks specialize in raw strength. Thanks to abilities like Reinforcement and United Front, they can accumulate an impressive amount of attack power that is sure to topple everything your enemy can throw at you. The element is very flexible and can be played on each lane effectively. However, cards like Catradran suggest sticking to the left and middle lanes, as it pushes enemies to the right. Patty can be a great opener, allowing you to draw your key combo pieces sooner. Meanwhile, Clary's Craze can be a very unpleasant surprise for your opponents. This element has a few key weaknesses though. Fire doesn't have any supportive movement cards on its own. United Front, the main gimmick of the element, heavily pushes you towards spamming the entire field with cards, making it difficult to implement supportive movement cards from other elements. This limitation doesn't apply to swap cards, so you could easily implement cards like Kasra and Ulk and move your overpowered units between lanes. The same applies in reverse. Cards like Luther can seriously sour your soup, so watch out for those. Ice decks specialize in weakening your opponent while being very PP efficient. It is the only element that allows you to manipulate PP on the field, giving you a unique advantage. Cards like Tia are already in the game, giving you 1 PP for using her, and soon there's gonna be Kanui. She is able to reduce your opponent's PP by 2, which can be really punishing to your opponent. This can force enemies into spending all of their PP as soon as possible, which in turn means you'll have more targets to debuff with your cards. Ice movement cards focus on pushing enemy units into fields where some of your strongest debuffs would hit. Their strongest debuffs target the left and mid lane, making Ice very compatible with fire strategies. Unfortunately, this also means Ice shares a lot of weaknesses with fire. Ice has no supportive movement cards, so, unless you mix it with other elements, you'll have a tough time moving your units around. Unlike fire, you don't have any ability that suggests spamming the field with cards, so strong move cards like Asanami or Katori are very easy to implement. Wind decks specialize in zooming around the board. It is the exact opposite of fire. Here, you don't want to clutter your board with cards that might stand in the way of your movement cards. Wind is strongest in the middle and right line. So, the strategy should be to focus on the left line first, and then force the rest of the fight to take place in the middle or right line. Cards like Luther can swap 2 cards of your opponent around, and if that doesn't help, cards like Kasra and Ulk can quickly reposition your cards into more advantageous positions. Wind lacks raw power and debuff cards, but has a few decent buff cards at their disposal. One of the biggest strengths of Wind is the ability to just completely screw over your opponent's plan by completely repositioning their cards. This deck requires a lot of planning and a mastery of summon order to secure victory. More on that later. Lightning decks specialize in taking lines swiftly. Their unique ability is called Base Buster, allowing them to deal extra damage to enemy lines. Unfortunately, this power comes with the trade-off that their base-busting cards often lack raw strength. However, the rest of the cards in that element do have a pretty decent mix of raw strength, movement and debuffs, but lack disruptive movement cards completely. Lightning decks usually want to start out on the left or right line, and then move to the middle. Cards like Katori feel perfect for that. Wind cards also provide a lot of disruptive movement cards, so these two elements seem to work really well together in general. Light decks specialize in defense and buffing. Cards like Shion and Sukuna Hime provide base guard, and are able to buy you extra turns in a pinch. Meanwhile, cards like Mother and 2nd generation Clary's Craze can heavily buff your cards on the left and right line. Light is weakest in the middle line. Cards like Asanami allow the element to quickly divert resources from the middle to the left and right, meanwhile Harrier does the reverse for your enemy. Because of this, their strategy usually revolves around starting on the middle line first, then moving to either left or right line. Light has a decent mix of everything. It is a jack of all trades element. However, it doesn't have a whole lot of effects to disrupt your enemy. I personally prefer splashing in a few dark element cards, since they're usually very flexible in what line they can support. Dark Matoy is a perfect fit here, since she provides stun to the two lines Light excels at. Dark decks specialize in stunning and pressuring opponents. They have a lot of raw power and have some decent debuffs, but lack any buffs of their own. Their move cards focus on pushing enemy cards into squares that are susceptible to stun cards, giving you a significant upper hand on the field. However, they don't have a whole lot of supportive movement cards. The few movement cards that they do have, and the amount of squares covered by stun effects, suggest to start fighting on the left line, and then move to either middle or right line. On those lines, 2 out of 3 squares can be disabled via stun. Cards like Corella feel right at home here. Now that you know all of the elements and how they operate, it is time to build your deck. Everyone starts out with a basic fire and ice starter deck, but if you spend a few AC, you get access to a wind and lightning deck, as well as a light and dark deck. These will save you a little bit of headache in pulling cards from the scratch, but if you want to recreate them to use as a basis, here you go. Going dual color is completely fine, but I wouldn't suggest a 50-50th split. These decks usually end up being very inconsistent, and we don't want that. We want strategies to be consistent so we can secure our victory. I suggest dedicating only 1/3 of your deck to different elements, unless you have 3 copies of either Patty or Seraphy. Having so much draw power will make even the most inconsistent decks consistent. Just don't forget to put cards into your deck to override summon on top of them. There is no golden ratio you need to adhere to with how many cards of certain PP cost you need to have. What matters is having a strategy and cards that synergize with each other, and that's different from deck to deck. If there is a key card that you really need to pull, in order to execute your strategy, don't be afraid of running multiple copies of it in your deck. Additionally, consider running either Rappy or Meow if you plan on having multiple elements. These cards have the ability Wildcard, and can be used to replace summons of any color, making them really flexible. They can also obfuscate what element you're playing. Cards like Clary's Craze can fit into any deck, as it's a pretty strong beat stick that can be summoned for just 4 PP due to the reinforcement ability. If you plan on using 3 PP cost cards of a different element in your deck, I suggest putting 5 PP cost cards of that same element as well. After all, you don't want to get stuck on a line with a weak card that can't be upgraded. Building a deck requires a lot of playtesting, so make sure to test it thoroughly against other players. When playing the game, it can be very beneficial to stay for a turn. This will allow you to observe your enemy's plan, and strategize your next turns better. Being able to predict your opponent's moves is extremely beneficial, as it allows you to pull the rug from beneath them before they can react. Staying also allows you to preserve PP for bigger plays in the next turn. This can be especially important if you plan on using cards with effects that are more reactionary than preemptive. When chaining move cards to one another, it is crucial to remember the turn order, otherwise your effects will play incorrectly, and screw you out of a play. First of all, supportive effects always activate before disruptive effects do. For example, you can't summon Azanami on the same turn as your opponent summons Harriet, and expect her to undo the movement of Harriet. Azanami will always activate first. You can however do this in reverse. Summon Harriet on the same turn as your opponent summons Azanami to undo her movement. Predicting this play can be really devastating for your opponent. Secondly, cards will always activate in the order in which you place them on the board. For example, let's say you want to move this card all the way to the right. You have to place Henri on the field first and then place Kasra. The same applies if you want to move cards while catching buff windows at the same time. And that's about it, honestly. Line Strike is a very simple game, so there aren't many obscure priority rules, or paragraph-long card effects. But no matter what tip I give you, nothing will save you from the utter chaos that is actually pulling the cards you want from the Line Strike scratch. Now that is truly diabolical. I hope this little guide was helpful though. If I missed any important tips, feel free to share them in the comments. I'll see all of you in the next video. Take care!